Tournament of Power Goku is a brand new leader introduced in Fusion World's second set, Blazing Aura, alongside a slew of your favorite ToP characters such as Kefla and Ribrianne. Oh, and he broke the game. It has only been a week since the release of Tournament Power Goku, or as some people like to name him, ToPKu. And specific to this past weekend, we have had a number of regional events, which is great. I love the fact that we're finally kicking off competitive play in the West, but unfortunately, the first meta that we really get to bite our teeth into may be in danger. To kick it off though, I feel like we need to understand what specifically ToPKu is doing so that we can then contextualize the conversation around his performances, why that might be an issue, and how we can move past this. Tournament Power Goku is a leader that on his front side is pretty unassuming. However, he does awaken at 3 life, which is typically low for leaders in Fusion World. His awaken ability, however, makes up for it in spades, paying 1 energy and discarding 1 card to be able to play a 4-drop Tournament Power card from your hand. Now, this isn't too unassuming in its own. However, when you combine that with the power of cards like Kefla, which allow you to play an additional 3-drop from your hand, which allows you to extend your wide boards, and the fact that cards you play will often replace themselves, now you're in a position where you're applying a ton of board pressure at no cost to your hand. On the surface, resource cheating is always the source of what tends to be able to break these types of games, and it's a fine line between finding the effects that make the game fun and engaging, but while not breaking it completely. And unfortunately, now we're in a position where, in combination with the ToPKu leader and Kefla, you are paying 1 energy to play out a 7 energy worth of cards. This is exacerbated by the fact that Kefla by herself is an incredibly efficient card. And for 5 energy, you're actually cheating out 14 energy worth of plays. That in its own right is incredibly strong, but actually kind of manageable. It's not incredibly balanced, but there is an opportunity to be able to kind of fight that off, depending on if you have the right board wipes or if you're able to defend against your opponent. There's a little bit of play there, even if they're cheating an absurd amount of energy. The top off, however, is that when we look at Ribrianne, she's a 4-cost 20k power with a 10k combo, because why not? That also has double strike, which means in ToPKu, for 1 energy, you can deploy a 20k double strike threat, which is incredibly off curve when you consider that every other double striker in the game starts off at 5 energy or higher because they're meant to close out the game. And for any of you guys who played Masters, which is the previous version of Fusion World, I think you'll notice that this card looks eerily similar to a card that has won what I would argue the most amount of games ever in Masters history before it got banned. Ribrianne is effectively furthering Destruction Champa, which allows you to close out games for 1 energy and effectively forces a hand check on your opponent. Oh, do you have not enough cards in hand? Here's my opportunity to be able to close out the game. And unfortunately, there's not a level of interaction present in the game right now to prevent that. At the very least, in Masters, we had negates that allow you to straight shut down your opponent's opportunity to be able to close out the game that way. But now we're in a position where, because those don't exist, the best case scenario you have is putting up a blocker or hoping that you have enough super combos in hand. And so rounding that out puts ToPKu in a really, really dangerous position. Not only is he cheating out an insane amount of resources, his cards do an incredible amount of utility when you utilize a bunch of negging power, a bunch of board extension, a bunch of card draw, and then finally has the most versatile finisher in the game, especially in combination with Glimpse of Arrogance, which not only allows you to be able to extend your plays, but as a closer presents 35k combo power if you're going to close out the game per copy. Now that's incredibly strong, but every other color also got support in set 2. So surely the numbers play out in a way where it's a little bit more back and forth. Unfortunately, that is not the case. There were 4 regionals happening this weekend, a week after release, and when you look at the numbers, it's not looking good. North Carolina Regional, which is the regional I attended, 174 of the 200 active participants were on the deck, putting that at an 83% representation. And if we look at topcut, 14 of the 16 slots were ToPKu. Going over to the other regions, and unfortunately, I don't actually have all of the numbers. These are just stats I was able to pull from Twitter. The Japanese finals were both ToPKu decks. The EU topcut, I believe, was 6 out of the 8 decks were ToPKu, and the other 2 were Red Beerus. And then the Latin American event was won by ToPKu. I can't understate how absurd an 83% representation is. The only time I can remember a meta being this bad is back in Eldrazi Winter in Magic the Gathering. And I wasn't even around for that. That's just like historical data that I know based off stuff I've seen in the past. And I guess for Yu-Gi-Oh players, I guess that would be Teledad format. There's a lot of discussion what is a tier 0 format, and a lot of people will point on, oh, hey, you know, if the deck can't be beat, that means it's a tier 0 deck because it can only be beat by itself. Or some people talk about meta representation, like, hey, anything beyond a 60% representation is at a point where it could arguably be considered tier 0. And I think we're at a point now where, sure, ToPKu can lose, and we're going to look at a little bit of that in the future. But when you're at an 83% representation, you're at a point where it doesn't even really matter whether the deck can be beat or not. You're at a point where 8 out of 10 times going into a tournament, that is what you're going to face round after round after round. Does it really matter whether the deck can be beat or not if it's just so effective at doing what it does that even a mid-range performance means you can actually win out your games against any other strategy? Inherently, the issue with the tier 0 format is the fact that it pushes out anyone from being able to play anything else. While I do think competitive players do appreciate tier 0 formats from time to time because you only really need to get good at that specific matchup, and that is a skill within itself. Sometimes I do appreciate components of tier 0 formats because I know what I'm getting ready for. It does force out the fact that a lot of people want to play with their favorite characters or diversify different strategies or just play against different decks. The fact that a meta like this forces you to have to play one matchup over and over and over again, and the fact that you're probably walking into a losing matchup if you're playing anything but that deck, really disincentivizes people from picking up the game, continuing to play the game, or trying to further and get better in the game. Pulling back from actually just competitive play, you have to consider the optics of the game. Set 2 hasn't come out digitally yet, and I think this is to the benefit of Fusion World at the moment. Already, Set 1 had really bad optics, with a lot of people who play semi-casually not liking how strong green was, amidst the other issues we have with the client around like things like card acquisition. Nevertheless, you have people like Rhymestyle who, while love the game, pressed on that it just felt really bad having to face things like Broly and Gohan game after game after game with the life gain and the 8-drop that you can't really interact with.
Well, I did what I could do. I did what I could do. It's just really goes to show you the problem of this game, actually. It actually shows you the problem. That was the pure starter deck, too. That wasn't like a this is the pure starter deck when you log into the game and choose which deck you want to play. Damn!
Now, if you pull that back and now have a tier 0 format where you're actually only playing ToPKu 9 out of 10 times, and that deck is incredibly strong to a point where you can only play that, and is a deck that's mostly composed of Set 2 cards and utilizes 10 plus SRs of that color, plus a handful of SRs from Set 1, you're in a position where you now have a technically very expensive deck to build that arguably is the only thing viably worth playing if you're not a top tier player. And even then, top tier players aren't really winning out all the time. There is a lot of conversation going around while people aren't used to it. Aggro will always do well at the beginning of the meta, and I agree. But when we're looking at the percentages that we're working with, it's just really tough to justify otherwise, especially when I know a ton of top players that tried to break that matchup for 2 to 3 weeks leading up to this tournament and all landed on choosing to play ToPKu instead. Kudos goes to Warp, a player in the community who actually got X2 in the tournament and ended up bubbling just shy out of top 32 with Blue Zamasu. But even to his own admission, if you do not play perfectly, and that goes alongside seeing the cards you need to see because we are a card game, you will lose. So while the deck has a lot of tools, and I think Blue can combat ToPKu decently well with Scythe, with things like Vegito, with board wipes in the form of Zeno, and then just trying to outvalue your opponent with things like Goku Black, that doesn't change the fact that you need to play perfectly to beat a okay to good ToPKu player. And at that point, the skill gap to be able to even contend feels so wide. Why would you put all that pressure on having to play perfectly when you can just be better at the mirror match and lend yourself having to play perfectly to have a chance throughout the tournament? Alternatively, Beerus is there, but Beerus is really just a different shade of the deck. And while I do think I value different leaders having success, and that kind of diversifies the meta a little bit, at the end of the day, if you're utilizing half plus the same cards as ToPKu is, kind of all boils down to the same thing. So now we're in a position where in meta, we can't really solve it. They build boards too fast, they apply too much pressure, they are able to combo out of nothing, and they're capable of playing a slow game as well as a fast game. So in general, the deck just has no true checks, which unfortunately means that we may have to look towards Bandai and a little bit of the hammer to deal with the current format. Then the question becomes, what do we look like? Are we banning the ToPKu? Are we banning Kefla? Are we banning Ribrianne? Are we dealing with erratas? There's a few ways that you could look at it. Of course, Kefla is the enabler. The big reason that ToPKu is as good as it is because he's able to play Kefla off his leader ability to cheat as much energy as he does, build the wide boards that he can, and be able to apply pressure the way that he can. I don't like the hit of Kefla though, because I do feel like it takes away from red as a whole, which truly does benefit from the card in a way that I don't think is too terrible. We've seen cards that play very similar to Kefla in things like yellow, where you can play Mecha Frieza to play a 4-drop King Cold, and other similar strategies like Ginyu and what have you. And I think red having the ability to be able to establish boards out of not much is something that it's sorely missed, especially since blue is becoming the king of one-on-one, and you just kind of need that staying power to stay relevant in the meta. Then there's the leader, and I think the leader is probably the most realistic hit. However, I don't believe they're going to ban it. You can't just ban a leader out of the 4 leaders you have access to in a new set, especially one where the entire archetype spins around it. Then preferably, I think we could look at an errata, and maybe that would make sense, but you have to be peculiar about the way you do erratas because you don't want to completely change a card, especially one that's been printed in physical. Finally, there's Ribrianne, and honestly, Ribrianne's insane. She's furthering Destruction Champa with extra steps, and that alone provides the deck so many ways to be able to close out. I think it would be much harder for ToPKu to actually be able to close out the amount of games it does if it did not have access to the double striker, plus being able to glimpse over the Ribrianne that it currently has as its main closer. In terms of what I would do, I honestly think you just need to errata the leader. I don't like massive erratas because I don't like the dissonance it creates between players who are picking up the card game, opening their packs. So it does have to be as minor as possible in my opinion. And honestly, I don't think it needs to be a big one. I think if you shift over the activate main ability from costing 1 energy to 2 energy, you're in a position now where now at 5 energy, the ToPKu player can't just set up lines of being able to play a Kefla, play a thing, pay for, play a Kefla, play a thing, or alternatively, play a Ribrianne and go into double glimpses. It just closes off lines, especially since a lot of people will stay at 3 life. So they need that 1 extra energy from time to time to actually be able to push the damage to go to 2 life so that then you can Ribrianne afterwards. I think at that point, you're in a position where you're still getting the vibe of being able to get your Tournament of Power stuff out for free and cheaper, but your 3 drops are only getting a 1 cost reduction and your 4 drops are only getting a 2 drop reduction at that point. And I think that makes it much more balanced. I still think it's good, and I still want ToPKu to be good. However, I think we need to tune it in to open up the meta to have other options so that people can play a varied amount of strategies and not just be forced to play 1 deck for the next 3 months. I'm not gonna lie, I'm honestly really pushing for an emergency errata at this point though. I think we're in a position where Fusion World has lost a lot of momentum, and a lot of that has to do with like communication on Bandai's side and the way that the game played out in the set 1 meta. And I do not think the game can truly afford a set 2 meta looking this bad, especially with the upcoming release of digital and a lot of people, hopefully fingers crossed, being really excited to get back into the game. And if we're having a Broly situation 2.0, but one that's even worse, then I think it's going to be very unwelcoming for people trying to get back into the game and could really hurt the game in the long term. Even though I will say I do much prefer ToPKu mirrors than I do Broly mirrors. Obviously, the optics are never good about banning things super early in the game's lifespan, but I think we're at such a miss about how powerful this is versus everything else that it's really hard to not justify. And with that, I would love to know how you guys think. Let me know in the comments down below what you guys think should be done. How do you guys feel about the game as is? Are you guys excited for set 2 that is coming out in 3 days in digital? Because I still am, and I'm going to do my best to try and stray away from having to play ToPKu and maybe do some fun things with green, yellow, and blue alternatively. That's it. I'll catch you guys on the next one.